March 1973 in New York City. Anderson Cooper, 9 years old, sat in a classroom at the exclusive Dalton School on Manhattan's Upper East Side. His teacher was taking attendance. When she reached his name, she read, "Anderson Hayes Cooper, Vanderbilt." Anderson froze. He had been using his father's last name, Cooper, trying to blend in. But the school records listed his full legal name, including his mother's famous surname. The other children stared. Everyone knew the name Vanderbilt. It meant wealth beyond imagination, mansions, railroads, power. But what those children didn't know was that Anderson's branch of the Vanderbilt family was nearly broke. His great-great-great-grandfather, Cornelius Vanderbilt, had died in 1877 as the richest man in America. His fortune was estimated at $100 million, over $200 billion in today's money. It was the largest personal fortune ever accumulated in America at that time. But by the time Anderson Cooper was born in 1967, nearly a century later, the Vanderbilt fortune was gone, spent, squandered, distributed among hundreds of descendants, lost to taxes, divorces, poor investments, and extravagant lifestyles. In 1973, when the last Vanderbilt family gathering was held at Vanderbilt University, 120 descendants attended. Not one of them was a millionaire. The greatest fortune in American history had evaporated in just 3 generations. How does this happen? How does a family go from unimaginable wealth to relative poverty in just 90 years? This is the story of the Vanderbilt fortune. From a poor farm boy who built a railroad empire to great-grandchildren who couldn't afford to maintain the family mansions. From ruthless ambition that created wealth to careless extravagance that destroyed it. From the Commodore who built everything to the heirs who lost it all. This is the Vanderbilt fortune, how the richest family lost everything. To understand how the fortune was lost, you must first understand how it was built. Cornelius Vanderbilt, the Commodore as he would later be called, was born on May 27, 1794, on Staten Island, New York. His family were poor farmers of Dutch descent. They had been in America for generations but had never risen above modest poverty. Cornelius was the 4th of 9 children. His father operated a small ferry service between Staten Island and Manhattan in addition to farming. Young Cornelius had almost no formal education. He attended school for perhaps 2 or 3 years total. He could barely read and write. His spelling remained atrocious his entire life, but he understood numbers, and he understood competition, and he understood that the fastest way to make money was transportation. At age 16 in 1810, Cornelius made a deal with his mother. She lent him $100, the family's savings, to buy a small sailboat. With that boat, Cornelius started his own ferry service, transporting passengers and cargo between Staten Island and Manhattan. He worked 7 days a week, often 16 hours a day. He was strong, aggressive, and willing to undercut competitors' prices. Within a year, he had repaid his mother and was making profit. Within a few years, he had bought more boats and expanded his routes. Cornelius had discovered his genius. He was brilliant at logistics, at understanding routes and schedules, at pricing to drive out competition, and at working harder than anyone else. By age 23, he had saved enough money to marry his childhood sweetheart, his cousin Sophia Johnson. They would have 13 children together, though only 11 survived to adulthood. But Cornelius didn't love his family more than he loved business. He was obsessed with making money. He worked constantly. He was harsh, demanding, and cared little for anything except profit. His wife and children saw him rarely. When he was home, he was often cruel and controlling. He terrorized his family with his temper and his expectations. But he made money. Lots of it. In 1818, at age 23, Cornelius made a crucial decision. He sold his boats and took a job working for a steamboat operator named Thomas Gibbons. It seemed like a step backward. Why would a successful independent ferry operator become an employee? Because Cornelius understood that the future was steam, not sail. Steamboats could travel faster and weren't dependent on wind. The man who controlled steamboat routes would control transportation. For 11 years, Cornelius worked for Gibbons, learning everything about steamboat operations. He managed Gibbons' New Jersey ferry routes and ran a hotel on the side. He saved almost every penny he earned. He lived frugally, despite growing income. His family lived modestly, while Cornelius accumulated capital. By 1829, at age 35, Cornelius had saved enough to go back into business for himself. He bought a small steamboat and started competing with established steamboat lines on the Hudson River and Long Island Sound. The established companies tried to drive him out. They lowered prices. They spread rumours. They tried to block his access to docks. Cornelius fought back with tactics that would define his career. He undercut their prices until they couldn't compete. He offered better service. He operated more efficiently. He worked longer hours. And most importantly, he was willing to engage in cutthroat competition that destroyed his enemies. He would start price wars that lost money in the short term, but drove competitors into bankruptcy in the long term. Once they were gone, he would raise prices and recoup his losses. It was brilliant, ruthless, and effective. By the 1840s, Cornelius Vanderbilt dominated steamboat transportation in the New York area. He operated dozens of boats on routes up and down the East Coast. People started calling him Commodore, a mock naval title that acknowledged his dominance of waterborne transportation. The nickname stuck for the rest of his life. By 1850, at age 56, Cornelius Vanderbilt was a millionaire, an enormous fortune in that era. He was one of the richest men in America, but he was just getting started. In 1851, gold was discovered in California. Thousands of Americans rushed west seeking fortune. Getting to California was difficult. You could travel overland by wagon, a dangerous journey taking months. Or you could sail around South America, equally long and dangerous. Cornelius Vanderbilt saw opportunity. He established a faster route, steamships from New York to Nicaragua, then overland across Nicaragua, then more steamships up the Pacific coast to San Francisco. The Nicaragua route was faster and cheaper than competitors' routes through Panama. Vanderbilt's accessory transit company made enormous profits. But in 1853, Vanderbilt made a mistake. He took his first vacation in 40 years, a grand tour of Europe with his wife Sophia, showing off his wealth. While he was gone, his business partners in Nicaragua betrayed him. They seized control of the accessory transit company and cut Vanderbilt out. When Vanderbilt returned and discovered the betrayal, he was furious. He allegedly wrote them a letter saying, "Gentlemen, you have undertaken to cheat me. I won't sue you, for the law is too slow. I'll ruin you." And he did. Vanderbilt established a competing route through Panama, undercutting the Nicaragua company's prices. He engaged in a brutal price war that destroyed the Nicaragua company within a few years. His former partners went bankrupt. Vanderbilt reclaimed his investment and it emerged stronger than before. The lesson was clear. Never cheat Cornelius Vanderbilt. He would destroy you, no matter the cost. By the late 1850s, Cornelius Vanderbilt was in his 60s and incredibly wealthy. He could have retired comfortably. Instead, he made the boldest move of his career. He decided to get into a completely different industry, railroads. Railroads were transforming America. They could transport people and goods faster than ships or canals. They opened up the interior of the continent. They were the future. But railroads were also chaotic, poorly managed, and often unprofitable. Many railroad companies were run by incompetent managers or corrupt speculators. Vanderbilt saw opportunity. He began buying stock in struggling railroad companies, taking control and reorganizing them for efficiency and profit. His first major acquisition was the New York and Harlem Railroad in 1862. It was a small, poorly run line operating in Manhattan and north to Westchester County. Vanderbilt bought controlling interest, fired incompetent managers, improved service, and made the railroad profitable. Then he bought the Hudson River Railroad, which ran along the Hudson River from New York City to Albany. Then the New York Central Railroad, which ran from Albany to Buffalo, connecting New York City to the Great Lakes. Vanderbilt merged these railroads into one system, the New York Central and Hudson River Railroad. It became the most important railroad in America, connecting New York City to the expanding West. Vanderbilt was in his 70s, an age when most men retired, but he was building the largest transportation empire in America. He was ruthless in his management. He fired workers who didn't meet his standards. He crushed competing railroads. He bribed politicians to get favorable legislation. He manipulated stock prices to maximize his wealth. But he also genuinely improved the railroads. He upgraded tracks. He built new stations, including Grand Central Depot in Manhattan. He standardized equipment and schedules. He made train travel faster, safer, and more reliable. By the 1870s, Cornelius Vanderbilt controlled hundreds of miles of railroad track connecting New York to the Midwest. His railroads carried millions of passengers and tons of freight annually, and he was making a fortune that dwarfed even his earlier steamboat wealth. Cornelius Vanderbilt's personal life was complicated and often dark. He was married to his cousin Sophia Johnson for 53 years. She bore him 13 children and endured decades of his cold, domineering behavior. Cornelius was not a loving husband or father. He worked constantly. He rarely showed affection. He controlled his family with an iron fist and expected absolute obedience. When Sophia died in 1868 after a long illness, Cornelius was 74 years old. His children expected he would remain a widower for his remaining years. Instead, just 8 months after Sophia's death, Cornelius married again. His new wife was Frank Armstrong Crawford, a distant cousin from Mobile, Alabama. Frank was 30 years old. Cornelius was 75. The marriage shocked New York society and enraged Cornelius's children. They believed Frank was a gold digger taking advantage of their elderly father. But Cornelius didn't care what anyone thought. He was the Commodore. He did what he wanted. For the last 9 years of his life, Cornelius seemed happier than he had ever been. Frank was energetic and social. She convinced Cornelius to build a grand mansion on Fifth Avenue and to engage more with New York society. Cornelius, who had spent his entire life focused on business, suddenly seemed to enjoy his wealth. But his health was declining. He suffered from various ailments and knew he didn't have much time left. So Cornelius began planning how to handle his fortune after his death. And this decision, how he divided his wealth, would ultimately doom the family fortune. In 1876, at age 82, Cornelius Vanderbilt was dying. He had accumulated a fortune estimated at $100 million, roughly $200 billion in today's money, adjusted for economic growth. It was the largest personal fortune in American history at that time, larger than the federal budget, larger than the total wealth of most states. Cornelius had 13 children, 11 of whom survived to adulthood. Logic would suggest he divide the fortune among them. But Cornelius didn't believe in equal distribution. He believed in concentrating wealth in the hands of the most capable heir. He despised most of his children. He thought they were weak, incompetent, and unworthy of his fortune. His oldest son, William Henry Vanderbilt, was the only one Cornelius respected. William had worked in the railroad business, proved himself capable, and earned his father's trust. So Cornelius made a controversial decision. He left $95 million to William Henry. The other children received relatively small amounts, between $200,000 and $500,000 each. His daughters received even less, as was common in that era. Women were not expected to manage businesses or large fortunes. The will was extraordinary. One son received 95% of the fortune. The others received scraps. Several of Cornelius's children immediately contested the will. They claimed their father had been mentally incompetent when he wrote it. They claimed Frank, his young widow, had manipulated him. The will contest became a public spectacle. Newspapers covered every detail: the family's dirty laundry, Cornelius's cruelty, his favoritism, his children's resentment was aired publicly. But ultimately, the courts upheld the will. William Henry Vanderbilt inherited nearly the entire fortune. On January 4, 1877, Cornelius Vanderbilt died at his home in Manhattan. He was 82 years old. He left behind the largest fortune in America, a railroad empire that dominated transportation, and a family that would spend the next century fighting over and squandering his wealth. The building of the fortune was over. The losing of it was about to begin. William Henry Vanderbilt was 56 years old when he inherited his father's fortune in 1877. He was different from his father in almost every way. Where Cornelius was aggressive and ruthless, William was cautious and conservative. Where Cornelius loved combat and competition, William preferred stability and efficiency. But William was also extremely competent. He managed the Vanderbilt railroads brilliantly, expanding the system and increasing profits dramatically. For 8 years, William ran the family empire, and he did something remarkable. He doubled the fortune. By the time of his death in 1885, William's wealth had grown to nearly $200 million, over $400 billion in today's money. He was briefly the richest man in the world, richer than the Rothschilds, richer than anyone. But William was not happy. The enormous wealth was a burden. He hated public attention. He resented being constantly asked for money. He found managing the vast fortune exhausting. In an interview with a reporter in 1882, William made a comment that would haunt the family. The care of $200 million is enough to kill anyone. There is no pleasure in it. William died suddenly in 1885 at age 64, probably from a stroke. And now came a critical mistake. William divided his fortune much more evenly than his father had. William left the bulk of his estate to his two eldest sons, Cornelius Vanderbilt the Sound and William Kissam Vanderbilt, but also left substantial amounts to his 6 other children. Each child inherited tens of millions of dollars. And this began the dilution of the Vanderbilt fortune. Instead of one heir with concentrated wealth, there were now 8 wealthy Vanderbilts. And each of them had children who would inherit. And those children would have children. With each generation, the fortune would be divided further. And with each generation, the heirs would be farther removed from the source of the wealth and less capable of managing it. The countdown to financial ruin had begun. The 3rd generation of Vanderbilts, the grandchildren of the Commodore, were the first to grow up in enormous wealth. They never knew poverty or struggle. They were born into Fifth Avenue mansions, attended exclusive schools, traveled to Europe regularly, and moved in the highest circles of society. And they began spending money at a rate that would have horrified the Commodore. The most extravagant was Alva Vanderbilt, who married William Kissam Vanderbilt, one of William Henry's sons. Alva was from Alabama, from a family that had lost everything in the Civil War. She was beautiful, ambitious, and determined to become the queen of New York society. In 1881, Alva convinced her husband to build her a mansion on Fifth Avenue that would rival any palace in Europe. The result was the Petit Chateau, a massive French Renaissance mansion that cost $3 million to build, roughly $100 million in today's money. But the house itself was just the beginning. Alva filled it with art, furniture, and decorations imported from Europe. She employed dozens of servants. She hosted lavish parties that cost fortunes. Her most famous party, held in 1883 to celebrate the opening of her new mansion, had 1,200 guests in elaborate costumes. It cost $250,000, roughly $8 million today, for a single night. The party achieved Alva's goal. She became the undisputed leader of New York society, but it also established a pattern that would destroy the family fortune. Vanderbilts competed with each other to build bigger mansions, throw more lavish parties, and display more ostentatious wealth. Cornelius Vanderbilt II built a 70-room mansion called the Breakers in Newport, Rhode Island. It cost $7 million and required a staff of 30 servants. George Washington Vanderbilt II built Biltmore Estate in North Carolina, the largest private home ever built in America. It had 250 rooms, required hundreds of workers to construct, and cost millions to build and maintain. Frederick Vanderbilt built mansion after mansion, homes in Manhattan, Hyde Park, Newport, and the Adirondacks. Each Vanderbilt tried to outdo the others. Each mansion had to be larger, more ornate, more expensive than the last. They were burning through money at an astonishing rate, but the fortune was so large that it seemed inexhaustible. It wasn't. The 4th generation, the great-grandchildren of the Commodore, were even worse. They grew up in unimaginable luxury, completely disconnected from the source of the wealth. They had never built anything, never worked in the family businesses, never understood how wealth was created. They only knew how to spend it. Reginald Claypool Vanderbilt, great-grandson of the Commodore, inherited a fortune of $15 million when his father died in 1914. Reginald had no business skills, no discipline, no understanding of money management. He spent money on gambling, alcohol, women, and lavish living. He married twice, had 2 daughters, including Gloria Vanderbilt, who would become famous in her own right, and squandered his entire inheritance. By the time Reginald died in 1925 at age 45, his fortune was gone. His daughter Gloria inherited almost nothing. This pattern repeated throughout the fourth generation. Vanderbilt heirs who had never earned money couldn't manage money. They spent lavishly, invested poorly, and slowly depleted their inheritances. The Great Depression of the 1930s accelerated the decline. Stock market losses, decreased railroad profits, and economic catastrophe damaged the remaining Vanderbilt wealth. The magnificent mansions became impossibly expensive to maintain. Property taxes, maintenance costs, and staff salaries consumed more money than the heirs could afford. One by one, the Vanderbilt mansions were abandoned, sold, or donated to institutions. The Vanderbilt family had gone from controlling the most important railroad system in America to barely being able to maintain their homes in just 2 generations. By the mid-20th century, the Vanderbilt fortune was effectively gone. The railroads had been sold or lost their value as automobiles and airplanes replaced trains. The mansions were too expensive to maintain. Most were sold, demolished, or donated. The descendants were numerous, hundreds of people carrying the Vanderbilt name, but the money had been divided and subdivided so many times that individual inheritances were modest. In 1973, a gathering was held at Vanderbilt University to celebrate the family legacy. 120 Vanderbilt descendants attended. According to family lore, not a single one was a millionaire. The greatest fortune in American history, carefully built over 80 years, had been completely dissipated in 90 years. How did this happen? The causes were multiple. First, division of wealth. Each generation divided the fortune among more heirs. What started as one fortune became dozens, then hundreds of smaller inheritances. Second, extravagant spending. The Vanderbilts competed to display wealth through mansions, parties, and lavish lifestyles. They spent faster than the fortune could generate returns. Third, poor investments and business failures. Later generations lacked the business acumen of the Commodore and his son, William. They made bad investments and lost money. Fourth, changing economy. The railroad industry declined as other transportation methods emerged. The Vanderbilt wealth was concentrated in an industry that became less valuable. Fifth, taxes, estate taxes, income taxes, and property taxes consumed enormous portions of each inheritance, especially after the tax increases of the Progressive Era and New Deal. Sixth, divorces. Multiple Vanderbilt marriages ended in expensive divorces that split fortunes further. Seventh, lack of financial discipline. Heirs who grew up wealthy never developed the skills or discipline to manage money properly. And eighth, simple time. No fortune lasts forever without active management and creation of new wealth. The Vanderbilts stopped creating and focused only on spending. Gloria Vanderbilt, and great-great-granddaughter of the Commodore, was born in 1924. Her father, Reginald Vanderbilt, died when she was just 18 months old. He had squandered his entire inheritance, leaving Gloria with almost nothing despite the famous family name. Gloria's childhood was difficult. Her mother fought with Gloria's aunt for custody in a sensational trial. Gloria grew up feeling like she didn't belong to the wealthy world that carried her family name. But Gloria became a successful artist, designer, and businesswoman in her own right. She built a fashion empire with her name on jeans, perfumes, and home goods. She made her own fortune independent of family money. She married 4 times, including to conductor Leopold Stokowski and to writer Wyatt Cooper. Her son with Wyatt Cooper is Anderson Cooper, the CNN journalist. Anderson Cooper has spoken publicly about the Vanderbilt fortune, or rather, the lack of it. He has said that when his mother told him there was no trust fund, no inheritance waiting for him, he was initially shocked. The Vanderbilt name suggested wealth, but the reality was different. Gloria Vanderbilt told her son, "My family went from being one of the richest families in the country to having no fortune in about 1 generation. I don't think you should count on having any money." Anderson Cooper has said this was the best thing that could have happened to him. It forced him to build his own career, to work hard, to create his own success rather than relying on inherited wealth. He has spoken gratefully about not having a trust fund, saying it motivated him in ways that inherited wealth never would have. The Vanderbilt story had come full circle. From Cornelius, who built a fortune from nothing through brutal work, to his descendants who squandered it through extravagance, to Anderson Cooper, who built his own success without family money. Today, if you want to see remnants of the Vanderbilt fortune, you can visit several places. Grand Central Terminal in Manhattan, built by Cornelius and later expanded by his descendants, still stands as one of New York's most iconic buildings. But it's owned by the city, not the family. The Breakers in Newport, Rhode Island, Cornelius Vanderbilt II's 70-room summer cottage, is now a museum operated by the Preservation Society. It costs millions annually to maintain. The Vanderbilt family couldn't afford to keep it. Biltmore Estate in North Carolina, George Vanderbilt's 250-room mansion, is still owned by George's descendants, the only major Vanderbilt property that remains in family hands. But it operates as a tourist attraction and winery to generate the income needed for its maintenance. Vanderbilt University in Nashville, Tennessee, founded with a $1 million donation from Commodore Vanderbilt in 1873, is now a major research university. But it severed official ties with the family decades ago after disputes over governance. Several other Vanderbilt mansions have been demolished, converted to museums, or repurposed as hotels or apartment buildings. The physical legacy of the Vanderbilt fortune exists, but almost none of it belongs to the family anymore. The fortune itself is gone, dissipated through generations of division, spending, and mismanagement. The Vanderbilt story is fundamentally different from other American dynasty stories. The Rockefellers built their fortune and managed to preserve much of it through careful estate planning, trusts, and continued business involvement. Rockefeller descendants are still wealthy today. The Rothschilds in Europe maintained their wealth through banking dynasties that continued for generations. The Rothschild name still means wealth and power in European finance, but the Vanderbilts lost everything. The fortune that the Commodore built through decades of brutal work was completely gone within a century. Why? The primary reason is that the Vanderbilts stopped creating wealth after the second generation. Cornelius Vanderbilt built the fortune through railroads and steamships. His son William managed and doubled it through careful railroad management. But subsequent generations didn't build new businesses or industries. They simply spent the accumulated wealth. They were consumers, not creators. The Rockefellers, by contrast, continued to create wealth through oil, banking, and investments for multiple generations. Each generation added to the fortune, rather than just spending it. Second, the Vanderbilts divided their wealth more evenly than other dynasties. While the Rockefellers concentrated wealth in trust that benefited all descendants while preventing individual heirs from squandering it, the Vanderbilts gave each heir control of their portion. This allowed individual Vanderbilts to spend their inheritances foolishly without restraint. Third, the Vanderbilts were more interested in social status than wealth preservation. Building mansions, throwing parties, and competing for social prominence consumed resources without generating any return. The Rockefellers, by contrast, were more interested in business and philanthropy than social display. They lived well, but didn't engage in the competitive extravagance that destroyed the Vanderbilts. Fourth, the Vanderbilt fortune was concentrated in one industry, railroads, which declined in the 20th century. Other dynasties diversified their wealth across multiple industries and investments. And fifth, later Vanderbilt generations lacked financial education and discipline. They grew up in luxury without understanding how wealth was created or preserved. There are some fascinating lesser-known stories from the Vanderbilt family that reveal the dysfunction and excess. When William Kissam, Vanderbilt's wife Alva, divorced him in 1895, at one of the first socially prominent divorces in America, she received a massive settlement. She then married Oliver Belmont and used her money to become a leading suffragette fighting for women's right to vote. Alva essentially used Vanderbilt money to fund the women's rights movement. She became one of the most important suffragettes in America, which would have horrified the misogynistic Commodore. Consuelo Vanderbilt, daughter of William Kissam and Alva, was forced by her mother to marry the Duke of Marlborough in 1895. The marriage brought the Vanderbilt fortune to British aristocracy. Consuelo's dowry of millions helped restore Blenheim Palace, the Duke's estate. But the marriage was miserable. Consuelo eventually divorced the Duke and married someone she actually loved. Her story became a symbol of how American heiresses were essentially sold to European aristocrats. Alfred Gwynne Vanderbilt, great-grandson of the Commodore, died aboard the RMS Lusitania in 1915 when it was torpedoed by a German submarine. He was last seen giving his life jacket to a woman passenger, helping save others while he drowned. His heroic death was one of the few truly noble acts in later Vanderbilt history. Harold Sterling Vanderbilt, great-grandson of the Commodore, was a champion yachtsman who won the America's Cup 3 times and invented contract bridge, the card game that became immensely popular. He was one of the few later Vanderbilts who achieved anything on his own merit rather than just spending family money. These stories show a family of complex individuals, some wasteful, some heroic, some talented, all connected by a famous name and a fortune that was slipping away. The Commodore would have been disgusted by what his descendants did with his fortune. Cornelius Vanderbilt spent his entire life accumulating wealth through brutal work, ruthless competition, and absolute discipline. He lived modestly for most of his life despite growing wealth. He worked into his 80s. He believed in concentrated power and competent management. If he could have seen his grandchildren building palatial mansions, his great-grandchildren gambling away millions, and his great-great-grandchildren reduced to using the family name to sell jeans, he would have been horrified. The Commodore built an empire. His descendants built mansions and threw parties. The Commodore created wealth. His descendants consumed it. The Commodore worked 7 days a week. His descendants worked at being fashionable. It's one of history's great ironies. The man who built the fortune through hard work and discipline created heirs who embodied the opposite values. Perhaps this was inevitable. Children of wealth rarely develop the drive and discipline of those who built the wealth. They take abundance for granted. Or perhaps the Commodore's own harshness created the problem. By concentrating the fortune in one son and neglecting his other children, he bred resentment and financial irresponsibility. His children and grandchildren saw enormous wealth but were given little training in managing it. They were raised in luxury but not prepared to maintain it. The Commodore was brilliant at business but terrible at creating a dynasty. He built a fortune but not a system to preserve it. The lessons from the Vanderbilt story are clear and still relevant today. First, wealth doesn't last without active management and creation of new value. You cannot simply live off accumulated capital forever. Fortunes must be actively maintained and grown, or they disappear. Second, division of wealth accelerates its dissolution. When a fortune is split among many heirs, each with independent control, the likelihood of preservation decreases dramatically. Third, extravagant spending is the enemy of wealth preservation. The Vanderbilt mansions, parties, and social competition consumed resources faster than investments could generate returns. Fourth, diversification is essential. Concentration in a single industry, railroads, made the Vanderbilt fortune vulnerable when that industry declined. Fifth, financial education is crucial. Heirs who don't understand how wealth is created and managed will inevitably destroy it. Sixth, purpose matters. The Rockefellers preserved their wealth partly because they had purpose beyond consumption. Philanthropy, business creation, public service. The Vanderbilts had no purpose beyond social status and pleasure. And seventh, family governance matters. Trusts, foundations, and structures that prevent individual heirs from squandering wealth are essential for multi-generational preservation. Modern wealthy families study the Vanderbilt story as a cautionary tale. It's an example of everything not to do if you want wealth to last beyond a few generations. In the end, the Vanderbilt story is a quintessentially American tale. It shows the possibility of rising from nothing to everything through talent, work, and ruthlessness. Cornelius Vanderbilt embodied the American dream, the poor boy who becomes the richest man in the country. But it also shows the fragility of wealth and the difficulty of passing success to future generations. It shows how quickly abundance can become scarcity, how quickly power can dissipate, how quickly dynasties can crumble. The Vanderbilt fortune lasted about 90 years from peak to effective depletion. That's barely 3 generations. 1 lifetime of building, 1 lifetime of maintaining, 1 lifetime of spending, and it was gone. Compare this to European aristocratic families who maintained wealth for centuries through primogeniture, entail, and careful preservation of family assets. The American system, with its relatively high estate taxes, its culture of individual freedom, and its lack of aristocratic traditions, makes dynastic wealth harder to maintain. The Vanderbilts experienced this firsthand. American law, American culture, and American individualism all worked against the preservation of concentrated family wealth. Whether this is good or bad depends on your perspective. It prevented the Vanderbilts from becoming a permanent aristocratic class. It forced later generations to make their own way. But it also destroyed one of the greatest fortunes ever accumulated, turning potential inherited privilege into mere historical curiosity. Today, the Vanderbilt name still carries weight, but it means something different than it did in 1877. To most Americans, Vanderbilt means Vanderbilt University, not the family. It means historical mansions you can tour, not a living dynasty. It means a name from the past, not a source of current power. Anderson Cooper is probably the most famous living Vanderbilt, but he's famous for his own journalism career, not for family wealth. Gloria Vanderbilt was famous for her fashion business and her marriages, not for inherited fortune. The Vanderbilt name opens doors and generates interest, but it doesn't come with money anymore. For Anderson Cooper, this was liberating. He has spoken about how the lack of inherited wealth motivated him, gave him purpose, and forced him to create his own success. That whole thing about being a trust fund person. I'm not one, he said in interviews. My mom's not one. Her mom wasn't one either. The Vanderbilt fortune is gone, but perhaps that's allowed later generations to be something other than wealthy heirs, living off ancestors' achievements. Perhaps the loss of the fortune freed them to become themselves. It's a silver lining to what is otherwise a story of spectacular financial failure. The great Vanderbilt mansions that still stand are remarkable time capsules. The Breakers in Newport receives hundreds of thousands of visitors annually. Tourists walk through rooms that once hosted the richest people in America, marveling at the excess and the beauty. But they're also implicitly asking, how could anyone spend this much money on a summer house? How could this level of extravagance be sustainable? The answer, of course, is that it wasn't sustainable. Biltmore Estate, with its 250 rooms, required an army of servants, groundskeepers, and maintenance staff. The annual costs were staggering even when it was built. Today, it's only viable as a commercial tourist operation. George Vanderbilt built Biltmore because he could, because he had inherited millions and wanted to create something magnificent. But he didn't consider whether his children could maintain it, or whether the fortune would last long enough to support such extravagance. George died in 1914 at age 51. His widow and daughter struggled for decades to maintain Biltmore, eventually opening it to tourists to generate income. It's the only major Vanderbilt mansion still owned by family descendants, but they own it as a business, not as a home. The mansion controls the family now, rather than the family controlling the mansion. One of the most poignant moments in Vanderbilt history came in 1968. Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney, great-granddaughter of the Commodore and founder of the Whitney Museum of American Art, had died in 1942. She had been one of the most accomplished Vanderbilts, building her own legacy through art patronage. But by the 1960s, the remaining Vanderbilts were facing financial reality. The family trust that managed some remaining assets was nearly depleted. A family meeting was called. Dozens of descendants gathered. They discussed whether to continue the trust or simply divide what little remained. According to family accounts, one elderly family member stood up and said, "The Commodore would be ashamed of us." The room went silent, because it was true. The Commodore had built a fortune through decades of brutal work, strategic brilliance, and absolute determination. His descendants had partied it away in less than a century. They had built mansions that became museums. They had thrown parties that became legends. They had lived lives of extraordinary luxury. But they had lost everything that mattered. The wealth, the power, the empire. The family voted to dissolve the trust and distribute what little remained. The Vanderbilt dynasty was officially over. The contrast between the Commodore's life and his descendants' lives is stark. Cornelius Vanderbilt started with nothing, worked 7 days a week, for decades, lived modestly despite growing wealth, built businesses that employed thousands, created infrastructure that benefited the nation, accumulated the largest fortune in America. His great-grandchildren inherited millions. Rarely worked, lived in absurd luxury, built nothing but mansions, created no value for anyone but themselves, lost everything. It's a story repeated throughout history. The first generation builds. The second generation maintains. The third generation squanders. The Romans had a saying, from shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves in 3 generations. The Chinese say, wealth does not pass 3 generations. The Brazilians say, father, merchant, son, gentleman, grandson, beggar. Every culture recognizes this pattern. Wealth created through sacrifice and hard work is often destroyed by heirs who never knew struggle. The Vanderbilts are simply the most spectacular American example of this universal phenomenon. Some economists and social scientists argue that the loss of the Vanderbilt fortune was actually good for America. Concentrated dynastic wealth creates aristocracy, they argue. It entrenches inequality and prevents social mobility. The Vanderbilts losing their fortune meant that money returned to circulation. It was spent on goods and services, supporting thousands of businesses and workers. The mansions, though wasteful from a family preservation standpoint, employed architects, builders, craftsmen, servants, and suppliers. They redistributed Vanderbilt wealth throughout the economy. The parties, though extravagant, supported caterers, musicians, florists, and countless other service providers. In economic terms, the Vanderbilts were excellent spenders. They moved money through the economy efficiently. From this perspective, the dissipation of the Vanderbilt fortune was economically beneficial. Better to have the money circulating than locked away in trusts, generating returns for already wealthy heirs. But this argument misses something important. The Vanderbilts could have used their wealth productively. The Rockefellers used their fortune to fund medical research, universities, and institutions that benefited millions. The Carnegie fortune built libraries across America. The Vanderbilts mostly just built mansions for themselves. They could have created lasting institutions. They could have funded research and education. They could have used their wealth to address social problems. Instead, they used it to compete with each other for social status. That's the real tragedy of the Vanderbilt fortune. Not that it was lost, but that it was wasted. There is one branch of the Vanderbilt family that managed wealth somewhat better, the descendants who owned Biltmore. George Vanderbilt's grandson, William Cecil, transformed Biltmore from an unsustainable private mansion into a profitable tourist attraction and winery. By embracing commercial operation rather than trying to maintain it as a private estate, the Cecil family preserved Biltmore and even generated wealth from it. Today, Biltmore Estate is one of the most visited historic homes in America. It employs over 2,000 people. It generates tens of millions in revenue annually. It's not the kind of wealth the Commodore built, but it's sustainable wealth, which is more than most Vanderbilts achieved. The lesson: adapt or die. The Vanderbilts who clung to the past lost everything. The ones who adapted to changing economic realities survived. Modern wealth advisors use the Vanderbilt story as a case study in what not to do. They point to specific mistakes: no family office or professional wealth management structure. Each heir managed their own portion independently, often poorly. No trusts or restrictions on spending. Heirs had complete control over their inheritances and could squander them at will. No requirement for financial education. Heirs grew up wealthy but never learned about money management, investing, or business. No family governance or communication. The Vanderbilts competed with each other rather than cooperating to preserve family wealth. No entrepreneurial culture. Later generations were taught to be socialites, not business builders. No sense of stewardship. Heirs viewed their inheritance as theirs to spend, not as a resource to preserve for future generations. No diversification. The fortune remained concentrated in railroads, which declined in value. No restraint on spending. The culture of competitive extravagance accelerated wealth destruction. Today's ultra-wealthy families study these mistakes carefully. They create family offices, establish trusts, require education programs, and build governance structures specifically to prevent the Vanderbilt pattern. The loss of the Vanderbilt fortune has actually helped preserve other fortunes by showing exactly what not to do. There's a haunting photograph from 1970 taken at the last major Vanderbilt family gathering. Over 100 descendants are arranged on the steps of Vanderbilt University's main building. They're dressed well, you can tell they're people of some means. But the photograph is a lie. These are the descendants of America's richest family, and not one is wealthy by the standards their great-great-grandfather would recognize. They have nice clothes and good educations. Some have successful careers, but the fortune is gone. Looking at that photograph, knowing the backstory is heartbreaking. These people carry a famous name. They're connected to one of the great American stories, but they're essentially ordinary upper-middle-class people now. The wealth that made the Vanderbilt name famous disappeared decades before they were born. They're living reminders that nothing lasts forever, that wealth is fragile, that dynasties crumble. That photograph represents the end of the American Gilded Age in microcosm. The world that produced the Vanderbilt fortune, unregulated capitalism, minimal taxation, extreme inequality, was gone by 1970. The world had changed, and the Vanderbilts hadn't changed with it. Anderson Cooper has reflected on his family history in interviews, offering insights into what it means to be a Vanderbilt today. He's described learning about the family fortune as a child and being shocked to discover none of it remained. "My mom grew up in very privileged circumstances," he said, "but she also grew up with this knowledge that money was not going to be there for her." Cooper has talked about how this shaped his own work ethic and ambition. Knowing there was no safety net motivated him. "I'm driven by fear of failure," he once said. "I always thought, what if I don't have enough money? What if I can't pay my rent?" Even though those fears were probably unfounded, they motivated me. He's also reflected on the irony of the Vanderbilt name. It suggests wealth and privilege, but for him, it was just a name. "People hear Vanderbilt and think you must be rich," he said. "But that fortune was gone long before I was born. I am rich because of my own work, not because of my family." There's something admirable about Anderson Cooper's perspective. He could have resented his family for squandering the fortune. Instead, he's grateful they didn't, because it forced him to build his own success. The loss of the fortune, in his case, was a blessing in disguise. The Vanderbilt story raises profound questions about wealth, inheritance, and American values. Should great fortunes be preserved across generations? Or is it better for wealth to circulate back into the broader economy? Is inherited wealth a burden or a blessing? Does it motivate or stultify? Should society encourage dynasty building? Or should we prefer that each generation earn its own success? The American answer has historically been ambiguous. We admire wealth creators like the Commodore, but we're also suspicious of inherited privilege. We allow people to pass wealth to heirs, but we tax estates significantly. We permit trusts, but we also have rules against perpetuities that prevent wealth from being locked away forever. We're uncomfortable with permanent aristocracy. The American ideal is that anyone can rise through merit, which implies that inherited wealth shouldn't determine outcomes. The Vanderbilt story fits this American ambivalence perfectly. We admire the Commodore's achievement while being somewhat satisfied that his descendants lost the fortune. It suggests that America remains, in some sense, a meritocratic society, that each generation must prove itself anew, that inherited privilege is temporary. Whether this is actually true is debatable, but the Vanderbilt story supports the mythology. Today, if Cornelius Vanderbilt were somehow resurrected and shown what happened to his fortune, what would he think? He would probably first be amazed by the modern world. Airplanes, automobiles, computers, smartphones, technology beyond his wildest imagination. He would see that transportation, his industry, had been completely transformed. Railroads still exist, but are no longer dominant. The fortune he built on rails would be worth far less today, but more than anything, he would be furious at his descendants. He would see the mansions they built and the fortunes they squandered. He would see how they divided the wealth among hundreds of heirs until individual shares were meaningless. He would see that they stopped building and creating, that they became consumers instead of producers. He would see that they cared more about social status than business success, more about parties than profits. And he would realize that his entire life's work, 80 years of brutal competition and relentless accumulation, had been wasted by people who never understood its value. The Commodore built an empire. His heirs built mansions, and then lost them. It would confirm his lifelong belief that most people, including his own children, were weak, foolish, and unworthy of wealth. But perhaps he would also see his own responsibility. He concentrated the fortune in one son rather than creating structures to preserve it across generations. He raised children in wealth but didn't teach them how to manage it. He was a brilliant businessman but a terrible father. Maybe in some parallel universe, an older and wiser Commodore would see that building a lasting dynasty requires more than just accumulating money. It requires teaching values, creating governance, and building institutions that outlast individuals. He would see that his greatest failure wasn't in business, it was in legacy. The Vanderbilt mansions that still exist are beautiful. They're architectural masterpieces that showcase the craftsmanship and artistry of their era. But they're also monuments to waste. The breakers cost $7 million to build in 1895, roughly $250 million today. It was used for perhaps 8 weeks per year as a summer cottage. Think about that. $250 million for a house used 2 months per year. That money could have built universities, hospitals, libraries. It could have funded research or supported thousands of families. Instead, it built a mansion that the family couldn't even afford to keep. The same is true of all the Vanderbilt mansions. Magnificent buildings, incredible art and craftsmanship, and ultimately, pointless. They generated no value except the temporary pleasure of their owners. They employed people during construction but created no lasting economic benefit. Compare this to Carnegie's libraries, which still serve communities a century later. Or Rockefeller's medical research institutions, which have saved millions of lives. The Vanderbilts had the resources to create lasting institutions. They chose not to. That's perhaps the saddest aspect of the Vanderbilt story. All that wealth, all that opportunity, and so little of lasting value created. The mansions are beautiful, but they're also tombstones, marking the death of a fortune. In the end, the Vanderbilt story is a cautionary tale about the ephemeral nature of wealth. Cornelius Vanderbilt died in 1877 as the richest man in America. His fortune seemed invincible, permanent, a dynasty that would last centuries. 96 years later, in 1973, his descendants gathered and realized the fortune was gone. Less than a century, 3 generations, $100 million to nothing. It's a sobering reminder that no matter how large a fortune seems, it can disappear. That wealth requires constant vigilance, wise management, and restraint. It's a reminder that building wealth is easier than preserving it, that creating a fortune requires one set of skills, but maintaining it requires different skills entirely. It's a reminder that without purpose, discipline, and governance, even the greatest fortunes will dissipate. The Commodore built an empire through ruthless focus and relentless work. His children and grandchildren destroyed it through careless extravagance and competitive waste. From shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves in 3 generations, from a poor farm boy to the richest man in America to descendants who carried a famous name but no fortune. The Vanderbilt fortune, built by one man over 80 years, lost by his heirs in 90. A story of ambition and achievement, of excess and extravagance, of rise and fall. A story that reminds us that nothing lasts forever, that dynasties crumble, that wealth is temporary, but also a story that reminds us that each generation must create its own success, that inherited privilege is no guarantee, that names are just names without the substance behind them. Anderson Cooper, great-great-great-grandson of Cornelius Vanderbilt, built his own success through his own work. In a way, he's more like the Commodore than any of the intervening generations. He built something from nothing, not a railroad empire, but a journalism career and personal wealth earned through his own efforts. The Vanderbilt name opened doors for him, but he walked through them on his own merit. Maybe that's the real legacy of the Vanderbilt fortune. Not the wealth, which is gone, but the reminder that true success must be earned, not inherited, that wealth without work is temporary, that privilege without purpose is meaningless, that the only fortune worth having is the one you build yourself. The Vanderbilt story ends not with wealth, but with lessons. Build, don't just inherit. Create value, don't just consume it. Invest in institutions, not just mansions. Educate heirs, don't just enrich them. Plan for generations, not just lifetimes. Preserve with purpose, not just possession. These lessons come too late for the Vanderbilts. Their fortune is history. But for anyone who creates wealth, or inherits it, or manages it, the Vanderbilt story is essential reading. It's a masterclass in what not to do. A warning written in marble mansions and empty bank accounts. The Commodore built the greatest fortune of his era, and his descendants proved that no fortune is great enough to survive. Incompetence, extravagance, and time. The Vanderbilt fortune. How the richest family lost everything. Built in 80 years, lost in 90. Remembered forever as a warning. This has been Bloodline Chronicles.